días y buenas tardes a todos, según donde se encuentren. Mi nombre es Joshua Paternina Blanco y soy
Good
oficial de
morning,
investigación en el
everybody.
Foro
My name is
Internacional de
Joshua Paternino,
Transportes en
and I
la
am part
OCDE.
of the ITF
Me complace en este momento a
in
las 10 de
the
la mañana de
OECD.
Argentina, 3 de
I
la
am
tarde
very
tiempo París,
pleased.
darles la bienvenida
10
a la que es
a.m.
nuestra
in
sexta
Argentina,
sesión en
3
esta
in
serie de
Paris.
conferencias
This is the
virtuales
sixth
sobre
session
descarbonización de
of the
transportes
virtual
en una crisis
conference
global sin
about
precedentes.
decarbonization of
Antes de
transport
extenderle
in
la
an
palabra
unprecedented
a Santos,
crisis.
Sonny
Before
Kodukula,
giving
quien será el
the
moderador del evento, me permitiré
the
dar
floor to
información sobre
Santos, who
algunos
will be the
detalles técnicos
moderator, I'm
y
going to
sobre el
give you some
contexto y
information about
trasfondo
some
de esta
technical
serie de
details
conferencias
and about
virtuales.
the idea behind this series
Antes
of
que nada,
virtual
me gustaría llamar
conferences.
su atención
Before
al hecho de que hay
we
interpretación
start, I want to tell
disponible
you that
tanto en
there is
inglés como en español.
interpretation in
Para acceder a
Spanish
ella,
and
pueden hacer
English.
clic
To
en el
be able
pequeño
to access
botón
it, you can
de
click
planeta o de globo que se
on
encuentra en la parte
the
inferior de
world
su pantalla en el Zoom.
icon
Simplemente
at the
escojan
bottom
su
of your
idioma de
screen.
preferencia
Just
y escuchen.
pick the language you
Les
need.
recomendamos igualmente que no apaguen el sonido original,
Please do
no
not turn
presione
off
el
the
mute
original audio.
original audio. Simplemente déjenlo como está para que pueda
Just
escuchar
leave
con
it as it
fluidez
is
la
so you can
conferencia
actually
en su idioma de
hear the whole
preferencia.
conference in your preferred language fluently.
Igualmente, para información, esta sesión
And
está siendo
also for
grabada
information,
y las
this is being
grabaciones de esta
recorded,
sesión, así como del
and all
resto de las
recordings
sesiones de esta
and
serie de conferencias,
presentations of
podrán ser
all of these
encontradas en línea
sessions
en el
will be found
enlace que ven
online
en este momento,
in the
igualmente que
link that's
aparecerá
on the
en el chat
screen right now,
compartido
and it will
por mis
also
colegas.
be on the chat
También los invitamos a
channel.
interactuar sobre el contenido de
You
esta
can
sesión en redes
also
sociales utilizando los hashtags
talk
que pueden ver
about
en
this
pantalla,
content in the
tanto Decarbonising
following
Transport Argentina
social
como
networks: in
Descarbonización
Decarbonizing
Transporte
Transport
Argentina,
Argentina and
y en el
Decarbonización
grupo
Transporte
de
Argentina, and
LinkedIn
also in the
que ponemos
LinkedIn
a
group
disposición de ustedes.
that is on the screen.
En la plataforma de Zoom
On
podrán,
the
para quienes no
Zoom
están acostumbrados a
platform,
utilizarla,
if you're not
recibir
used
información en el
to
chat de parte
using
de
it,
mis
you can
colegas, quienes
receive
estarán publicando
chat
información relevante sobre la
information,
conferencia
relevant
e
information
iniciativas
about the
afines.
conference and initiatives that are linked to
También
this one.
podrán hacer
And you can
preguntas y
also
respuestas en el botón
do
Q&A y al
put
final de la sesión
questions
habrá
on
un
the
espacio
Q&A
para que los
button, and at
panelistas
the end
puedan
of the
responder
session
a
we will
algunas de
have
ellas.
some time
Un
for the
consejo que les
panelists to
damos
answer your
es que
queries.
hagan las
We
preguntas lo más
advise that
temprano
you
posible, apenas se
ask
les
the questions as
ocurran,
soon as
para
you
que podamos
can,
tener el
so that we can
mejor
have
intercambio y
time
receptividad de
enough
los
to
panelistas posible.
pick them and post them
Y
to
bueno,
the
ahora sí,
relevant
volviendo
panelists.
al trasfondo del proyecto y de
Going
la
back
conferencia que
to
nos
the
trae acá hoy.
project that we
Esta sesión es parte
are
de un
here
proyecto mayor
today for
sobre
this. This
descarbonización
is
de
part
transportes
of
en economías
decarbonizing transport
emergentes o
in
DTEE.
emerging economies,
DTE es un proyecto
or
llevado a cabo en
DTEE. It is a
conjunto
project
entre el Foro
that has
Internacional de
been
Transportes y el Instituto Wuppertal.
done between the
Se encuentra financiado por la
Wuppertal
Iniciativa
Institute and
Internacional
the
del Clima
International Transport
del
Forum
Ministerio Federal para el
and
Medio
the Federal
Ambiente, la Protección de la
Ministry for the
Naturaleza
Environment,
y
Nature
la Seguridad
Conservation and
Nuclear
Nuclear
de Alemania,
Safety of
y busca
Germany
apoyar a
is
autoridades de
supporting
4
us, and it
países,
wants to
Argentina,
support
Azerbaiyán,
authorities of 4
India y Marruecos,
countries, Argentina,
para que puedan
Azerbaijan,
descarbonizar
India,
el
and
sector de
Morocco, so
transportes de
that
sus
they can
respectivos países.
decarbonize the
Igualmente, busca
transport sector in their
promover el
countries.
diálogo
It also
e
wants to
intercambio de ideas y
promote
políticas
dialogue
públicas sobre
and the
descarbonización de
exchange of
transportes
ideas and
en las
public
4
policies when
regiones
it
en las
comes to
que
transport in
estos
the 4
países se
regions
enmarcan.
that
Esta
these
conferencia en
countries
particular está
belong
siendo
to. This
desarrollada para el
conference
componente
is
argentino y
being
latinoamericano de
developed
este
for the
proyecto,
Argentine and
y
Latin
además
American
del
part of this
FIT y
project,
el Instituto Wuppertal.
and besides from the
Contamos y
ITF and the
agradecemos la
Wuppertal
participación
Institute. We
del Ministerio de
thank the
Transporte de
participation
Argentina,
of
de la
the
Asociación
Transport Ministry
Sustentar
of
y de la
Argentina
Plataforma
and
para
the
América Latina y
Association
el Caribe,
Sustentar and the
ETSLAC, a la
Platform for
cual
Latin
Sustentar
America and the
pertenece.
Caribbean that Sustentar belongs to.
La serie de conferencias, muchos
The
lo deben
series
saber,
of
empezó el
conferences,
7 de
as many
julio y
of
se
you know,
extenderá
began
hasta
on the
el
7th
30 de
of
este mes,
July and
jueves de la
will
semana que viene.
carry on
En
until the
total
30th of
tendremos
this
9
month.
webinars
We will
abiertos,
have
siempre a esta
9
misma hora.
open webinars.
Durante esta serie de conferencias,
During the
además, el
series of
objetivo ha sido
conferences,
y siempre
the
seguirá siendo el poder
goal has
entender
been
cómo se pueden
to be able to
descarbonizar
understand how to
las actividades de
decarbonize
transporte para diferentes modos en
transport
economías
activities
emergentes, al
in
mismo tiempo de que se
emerging
responden a
economies,
las prioridades de política
and
pública que ha traído
responding to the
el
public policies
COVID-19.
that
Algunas de estas
COVID-19 has brought
prioridades,
about.
solo
Some of these
nombrándolas, podrían ser
priorities
relanzar la economía,
could be to
desarrollar
relaunch the
sistemas de
economy, to
transporte más
develop
resilientes
transport
y
systems that
garantizar
are more
servicios de
resilient, and
transporte
to
esenciales
guarantee
al mismo tiempo que se
essential
cumplen con
transport
criterios
systems,
sanitarios ligados
and
a la
at the
crisis.
same time satisfying
La sesión de hoy
health
como lo saben, tratará
conditions
temas
relevant
de
to the
descarbonización de
crisis. Today
transporte
we
y
will speak
logística
about
urbana en
decarbonization
tiempos de crisis.
of transport and
Habiendo
urban
dado este
logistics in
contexto,
crisis
finalmente me
times.
permito presentar al
Finally,
moderador
I
de la
want
sesión de hoy.
to introduce the
Sonny
moderator for
Codocula es
today.
coordinador
Sonny
del proyecto
Codocula is
DTE para Argentina
the
dentro del Instituto
project
Wuppertal.
coordinator of
Tiene una
Argentina
larga
country
experiencia
led
trabajando
for
en pro de la movilidad urbana
DTE
sostenible
project. He
de mano
has
con
been
autoridades de
working
varios
as
países.
an urban
Y
planner and
también ha
engineer for
trabajado
16
en
years.
temas
He has
afines
also
para
worked
organizaciones como GIZ
with
o ICLEI.
GIS and
Tiene una
ICLE,
maestría en gestión
and
medioambiental de la
he has
Universidad
a
de
master
Maidol de Tailandia
of the
y una
Maidol
licenciatura en ingeniería mecánica.
University of
Sin más que
Thailand,
decir,
and he has a
les
bachelor's
deseo
degree in
disfruten esta
engineering.
conferencia y les dejo
Please
con mi
enjoy this
colega Sonny
conference.
Codocula.
Sonny Codocula will now take the floor.
Thank you, Joshua, for the introduction. Hello and a very good day to all. I'm Sonny Codocula. I work as a project coordinator at the Wuppertal Institute. The Wuppertal Institute is a German research think tank working on various issues relating to climate, environment, and energy. And urban mobility is one of our key cross-cutting focus areas. In this session, we'll be discussing the topic of urban trade. The topic is very relevant as more than half of us, the world population, now live in urban areas. Lifestyles are improving and access to goods and services has increased across the globe. And one of these reasons could be the digital innovation has enabled us to have an increased access to goods and services. And the concept of getting orders the next day is gradually becoming the norm in many countries. And as end users, we are also attracted to this offering. But this means more movement of smaller packages and more deliveries spread throughout the day. And as cities become densely populated, this complexity further increases as the streets are furthermore filled with vehicles. This demands for a change in the way how we address this issue, and we need to find innovative options. So in this session, we'll talk about these various challenges that urban logistics faces. And in the context of the current COVID crisis, we'll see how this complexity is further amplified. We'll also see examples from cities on how they address the urban freight challenge and how innovation eases or worsens the situation. We'll also learn about the specific challenges for Argentinian cities and the options that are available to overcome these challenges and move closer to the grand goal of decarbonizing the urban logistics sector. To help us understand this, we have a great lineup of speakers. They are experts, practitioners, and key decision makers. We'll hear from them their take on decarbonizing the urban logistics sector in the backdrop of the current COVID crisis. Just to remind, each presenter will have 10 minutes to deliver their inputs, and at the end of all presentations, we'll have a question and answer round. So the audience is requested to post their questions in the question and answer box, and all the questions will be populated and we'll address them in the Q&A round. And if your question is directed to a specific speaker, please mention the name of the speaker in your question. So without further delay, let's go to our first speaker. So our first speaker today is Dr. Matthias Winkenbach. Dr. Winkenbach directs the MIT's Mega City Logistics Laboratory. He's also the director of the MIT's Computational and Visual Education Lab, and he's a distinguished scholar and frequently publishes in top-tier academic journals. Dr. Winkenbach received his doctorate in logistics and supply chain management from the WHU Otto Beisheim School of Management in Germany. So Matthias, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Sunny. Let me quickly share my screen. All right. Okay, good. So I hope you're seeing my screen. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. My name is Matthias Winkenbach, originally, as you can tell from the name, from Germany, but been a research scientist with MIT for bit more than 5 years now, leading, as Suni already mentioned, 2 labs over there. Today, I'm kind of wearing my hat as the director of the Megacity Logistics Lab, which is kind of the think tank, if you wish, within MIT that does a lot of work around urban mobility, urban logistics. So basically how to provide goods and services to dense urban centers. And we work a lot actually on research projects in collaboration with the private sector, but also the public sector. And I hope to be able to share some of those insights from those projects with you today. So quickly, like, why urban logistics? Why the focus? And I mean, obviously, cities are facing a tremendous number of challenges these days. And from a logistics point of view, actually, one of the biggest challenges is, not surprisingly, urbanization. So as Suni mentioned before, right now, about 50% of the world's population is already living and working in the cities of this world. And the UN projects this number to rise drastically within the next couple of years. So it'll reach around 68, 70% by the year 2050. So from a logistics point of view, the problem about that is not so much that there's going to be more cities or that cities are going to be bigger. The problem actually is that much of that growth is not going to kind of materialize in terms of the cities growing physically in size, but rather cities growing in density. So basically growing upwards, because actually, if you look at many cities around the world, they are usually confined by physical boundaries to growth. Think of Mexico City, for instance. It's surrounded by mountains. So at some point, it just can't grow further in its physical extent. It has to grow through density. Same thing with many other cities around the world. And so we see a rapid increase in urban density. And that density is actually the major challenge to efficient urban logistics services, because density drives congestion. Density drives uncertainty around logistics processes that then again make last mile operations less efficient, require last mile operators to drive more miles, to spend more time within the city, and therefore obviously be or create a stronger pressure on cities also as a living environment in terms of emissions, congestion, and other negative externalities of urban freight. So urbanization, and with urbanization, the growth in urban density is really the key challenge to reliable and efficient urban logistics services. The second effect that we all contribute to is what we usually refer to on-demand consumerism. So I guess all of us are probably frequent shoppers at Amazon and other kind of e-commerce platforms. And with this increasing request for or demand for online commerce, we also see an increasing kind of expectation level of consumers with regards to urban logistics services. So for instance, while not so long ago, all of us were kind of fine with ordering something online and maybe receiving it 4 or 5 days later, now the expectation in many parts of the world already is that I order something today and it shows up at my doorstep tomorrow. In some markets, it goes further than that, and people are actually already expecting free same-day or even instant delivery services. And actually, on that slide, you see that number, the 60%, that's from a consulting study that I found. But it's actually quite interesting because many consumers basically already consider same-day delivery services or instant delivery services as a given and as a main driver of their loyalty to a brand. And that's why so many retailers, especially of CPG products, are driving for logistics capabilities, especially in those dense urban markets that were unheard of before, like something like deliver within an hour or two. So these on-demand logistics services are clearly on the rise, and obviously put additional pressure on urban transport systems, and therefore also on the livability and the emissions footprint of cities. So to cater for these increasing kind of consumer requirements, many companies nowadays actually adopt what we would call a hyper-local fulfillment strategy. So what does that mean? It basically just means that while a couple of years ago, most of the last mile operations for urban centers were operated out of one or at least just a few centralized distribution centers that were somewhere outside of the city. Now that consumers want things faster and want things more on demand, that kind of fulfillment strategy, shipping something into the city from further outside of the city, just doesn't work anymore. So a lot of companies actually invest in hyperlocal fulfillment capabilities. So basically using local storage local inventory positions to fulfill online demand. So actually already today, if you look at same-day services around the world, you'll see that 85% of these same-day delivery services actually rely on local inventories. Sometimes these inventories are just basically leveraging inventory that's already there in an existing physical retail store. But sometimes these inventory positions are already also just created just for the purpose of fulfilling this new stream of online demand. We call these dark stores typically. So these are literally prime locations in urban centers that probably used to be used for retail activity or housing and are now basically repurposed for logistics activities. And here's an interesting thing about especially Latin America, because Latin America, or at least many countries in Latin America, are characterized by a very strong traditional retail market. So there's a lot of what we would call nano stores or mom and pop stores. So a lot of highly fragmented, very small retail outlets that are, however, very close to the consumer. So these actually could pose a great potential to enable hyperlocal fulfillment capabilities from those stores for the retailers that are trying to serve their consumers more directly and more dynamically and more on demand. Obviously, you will ask, well, how is that going to work from just a transportation point of view? And one thing that we observe in many of the projects that we do is that companies also move away from a unimodal to a multimodal delivery approach. So as we move away from just shipping stuff from a centralized DC on a big truck into the city, and as we move towards having satellite facilities, so for instance, those smaller retail stores or those dark stores in the center of the city, that actually also enables company to be a little bit more smart about the mode of transportation that they're using. So we see, for instance, a lot of companies already experimenting with using larger vehicles to bring goods into the city to basically replenish those local inventory positions and make use of the large capacity of these vehicles to consolidate goods flows and therefore get stuff into the city relatively efficiently. And then use those satellite facilities to basically transship goods from the larger vehicles to smaller, more agile, and potentially more ecologically friendly vehicles. So, for instance, a lot of the companies that we work with have experimented with using cargo bikes, probably electrically supported, but still cargo bikes, as the last means of transportation from a local storage location to the final set of consumers. And obviously, those cargo bikes were chosen partially because they are more flexible, they're more agile, they can actually maneuver the highly congested urban center more efficiently than a big truck, but also because they yielded cost efficiencies and last but not least, also yielded a much more favorable ecological footprint, so less emissions and less congestion. And obviously, as technology progresses, we see more and more of these ideas arising. We see companies trying to combine, for instance, drones as a means of transport with a more traditional means of transport, like the conventional combustion engine truck. And sometimes combining these technologies can actually make sense because you're trying to basically leverage the strengths of both worlds, the strength of the old traditional big truck with the strength of the flexible, highly modern drone, for instance. Another thing that we are exploring quite actively is using public transportation infrastructure to bring goods into urban centers without having to basically send an additional fleet of combustion engine vehicles, for instance. Now, if you kind of think about what I just said in the last couple of slides, you can basically think of the evolution of last mile logistics as being like a two-dimensional one. I said before, we're moving away from centralized distribution networks towards more decentralized, more localized distribution centers, distribution networks. And at the same time, we're seeing a shift from unimodal approaches to multimodal approaches. So basically these two effects together, hopefully will enable the future last mile logistics services to serve both the increasing demand for faster and more agile and more dynamic last mile delivery services. They will hopefully also be able to overcome the challenges that are posed by urbanization, like for instance, increasing congestion and reduced mobility. And eventually, since it enables multimodal systems with hopefully more ecologically friendly vehicle types being chosen, it should also alleviate the ecological pressure on cities that arises from urban goods movement. So what do we do as researchers here? We basically help companies, but we also help policymakers making better decisions and designing those future systems. So the two main areas of activity here fall in what you would usually call predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics. So predictive analytics basically trying to understand and anticipate what is going to happen, while prescriptive analytics basically means to build models that help decision makers identify design alternatives and choosing the design that yields the best system performance. So what does that mean practically? For instance, predictive analytics, a very important field of research, is trying to come up with better spatiotemporal demand predictions. So basically anticipating what kind of demand from which kind of consumer is going to happen when and where within a city. Because only if you know that, and if you can anticipate demand in the near future, you're actually able to kind of adjust a multi-tiered distribution system such that you get to that consumer in the most efficient way and with the least congestion and emission footprint possible. Prescriptive analytics, on the other hand, means building tools that help people, for instance, route vehicles in a more efficient way. And that means maybe not finding the cost-efficient route anymore, but trying to find the route that optimizes the overall emissions and congestion footprint of an entire fleet, even if that means maybe spending a few more dollars on that route. But if you can basically reduce the overall footprint of your delivery operations on the overall city, that may yield positive outcomes on the triple bottom line of sustainability, basically. So here we're working actively with our research partners on building these models, building new methods to really be able to manage the increasingly dense urban centers and the increasingly dynamic distribution services to these urban centers more effectively. And yeah, hopefully the discussion later will enable me to give a few more examples of what can and cannot be done these days. With that said, I hope I didn't kill too much of my 10 minutes, and I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for the very insightful and thought-provoking presentation, I should say. Yeah, so it gives a wonderful global approach of urban logistics, the state of affairs of urban logistics. In our next presentation, what we do is we go more to a local perspective from the city of Rosario in Argentina. And for that, we have Ms. Eva Jakonovic, who is the Secretary of Mobility in Rosario. And she's also the president of Rosario's Transport Authority. And prior to Rosario, Ms. Jakonovic was working for the city of Buenos Aires as the Director of Transit and Transport. And she has a master's in transport planning and economics and is a civil engineer. So Eva, the floor is yours.
Bueno, buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I will give a more local perspective when it comes to the cities, how we're working on this. As I was saying, I work in Rosario at the moment. For those who don't know this city, Rosario is the third biggest city when it comes to population in Argentina. We have around 1 million inhabitants, and it is an urban conglomerate that takes in about 20 other cities and municipalities, and it consolidates in a greater Rosario with about 1.3 million inhabitants. It is a very it's a city that is very close to the Paraná River, and it is a port city, therefore. We export grain from there, agricultural products. 80% of the Argentine export market goes through Rosario when it comes to agricultural products. And when we think about cities, when it comes to the problems of urban logistics, I wanted to give you an overview of why we have gotten to the point where urban logistics is a problem for cities and we have not been able to reach a solution to our needs. To begin with, and in Latin America per se, we've been working for many years with regards to mobility, focusing on people as a priority. And when we work like that, we have forgotten of the importance of provision in urban centers when it comes to giving life to our cities. And we ended up having these type of problems. Transport services that end up being the offloading of products in interrupting the traffic and having all of the products on the pavement. And these are problems that bother both cars and people who walk. And there's so many actors in the logistic chain. And if we take all of them into account, it's very difficult. We have, of course, the person who wants to transport the goods, the individual consumer, the owner of the shop. Everybody has their own needs and their own interests to cater for. And on the other hand, we have the multiplicity of loads that they receive. It is not the same to move a package that I may order over the internet to my home than the hauling of big loads, such as, for example, pop sodas to a particular store in the center of the city, or when you move dairy products for a particular shop. So that's when you begin to see the complexity of actors, the complexity of the products that we are moved, and many interests that when it comes to regulating, as a government, as cities, we want to be able to cater for everybody and to generalize situations that perhaps cannot be generalized. They cannot be contemplated within one rule, and these things happen. It becomes a bit confusing for the person who is delivering. Where can they maneuver? And also everything falls on higher costs, not only financial, but also environmental, and also to do with safety on the roads, because a truck that did not have the right way to offload, they end up doing more kilometers downtown, or they park badly and they generate a problem for traffic. There's more congestion, and there's also more emissions of contaminating fuels. So the problem of logistics is clearly for cities a very complex issue. It requires, if we don't take it holistically and analyze what are the interests of each of the sectors that participate in the distribution chain, this will be a much more difficult issue to resolve. If we begin to have individual or partial solutions from each perspective, it ends up being just like a band-aid on a very big and complex problem. In the midst of all this, the crisis that we have when it comes to resolving urban logistics, here comes the pandemic and brings even more challenges, at least in Rosario and in many cities of Argentina. The pandemic has driven e-commerce, which was not used so much, and this brings a big challenge as well. Changes in the mobility of the city, more or incentive for buying near your home, in the shops near your home, changes in the work schedules, and also changes in the mobility of people, changes for the public transportation system, and all of these things will have to be thought about and incorporated in the challenges that we were already facing when it comes to urban logistics. In that sense, just to tell you about some of the things we're working with in Rosario, there are two main things. First, we want to work on the growth of e-commerce and to organize it better. We've created a platform so that the small businesses and small stores that did not have the ability to sell through the web can do so in a free platform for the stores that want to sign in together with the bank of the city. On the other hand, to work with regards to lowering emissions when it comes to transport in the city. We know between 7 to 8% of the emissions of carbon dioxide in the cities are due to logistics. And by 2050, this will triple. And therefore, it is key to work on the decarbonization of this when it comes to transport of goods in urban logistics. We are working together with associations such as Sustentar and also including the private sector in a good practices manual for efficiency in transport for goods. These good practices entail recommendations when it comes to driving, the use of fuels, the maintenance of vehicles, so that we may be able to get a document for all those companies and transport services in the city. Lastly, the refurbishing of public space to give the city a place where they can hold, a place that cannot be static because the city is dynamic, but when we understand the importance that the city has when it comes to getting goods to keep alive, we understand that they might have their own space so they can actually do the loading and offloading. And also what we have up until now are challenges. Challenges when it comes to the public and private sector, the role that the state has in this, what Matthias spoke about before, to get the data needed, the management and the collecting of data when it comes to predicting, which may help us when it comes to predicting mobility, transport, when it comes to dealing in a dynamic way with the use of spaces for urban logistics, and of course the use of more sustainable vehicles, the last mile part being used for cycles, bicycles or tricycles. Of course, the rules have to be changed because they're not good enough for the dynamic and the life that we lead straight away now that it has transformed so much in the last few months and the last few years. And finally, the incorporation of technology as an improvement tool in mobility in general, so it can be adapted to the real time and the dynamic of the life in the cities.
Great, thank you so much. That was a very nice presentation, Eva. It's very good to know the effort that Rosario is putting into addressing urban logistics, and I really like the highlight that you made for the need for stakeholder involvement and addressing the issue in a holistic approach. Because from our work with cities, we see that usually they see in some cities approach it in silos, and at the end they think that why is there no result, but it's because of the lack of a holistic approach. Great. So at this point, I would also like to remind the audience that if you have questions to the speakers, please do put them in the question and answer box. and we'll ask your questions at the end of all the presentations during the question and answer round. So continuing with the experiences of cities, we have our next presentation from the city of Bogota in Colombia. And with us, we have Mr. Nicolas Estupinian, who is the Secretary of Mobility of Bogota. And he has over 15 years of experience in urban mobility. And prior to the current role, Mr. Estupinian was the Director of Knowledge and Infrastructure and the Head of Urban Transport Unit at the Development Bank for Latin America, or commonly known as the CAF, in Buenos Aires. And he also served as the Vice Minister for Transport in Colombia between 2012 and 2014. And Mr. Estupinian has a master's in city planning and transport from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is a civil engineer from University de los Andes in Colombia. So Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Sunny, thank you very much. It's a pleasure hearing you and seeing you again. Thank you for the invitation. And I just want to say hi to all my Argentinian friends, which I miss a lot. Pedro, Eva, and all of you guys. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm a little bit sorry if I'm gonna pose here more questions than answers. Bogota, as you know, has a lot of experience and is a little bit more known for the experience that Bogota has with passengers. And now when we're trying to deal with decarbonizing transport, urban transport, and specifically talking about cargo and freight, then I have to acknowledge and recognize that Bogota has less experience. We have been trying to develop for at least a decade a few projects that somehow are not being able to be completed and be finalized. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about what Bogota is trying to do now, of the different plans that we had before the pandemic started, and now how we are trying to adjust some of these plans and projects that we are reaching out. And I feel that freight is far more comprehensive and challenging than passenger transport. I'm not sure if Eva and Matthias feel the same way, but being at the public sector, I feel that you have more tools and you have different options when you're trying to deal with passengers. While when you're trying to work with freight, you need to manage more stakeholders, and you need to build on what the private sector is doing, and you have to articulate in a more holistic and comprehensive manner all the different projects and all the different actions. So I'm going to share more questions than answers. As you know, Bogota is the capital of Colombia. We're talking about 8+ million people. It's the 7th largest metropolitan area in the world. And we have a lot of trips. We have over 12 million tons of cargo that entered the city of Bogota in 2019. As you know, Bogota is in the middle of Colombia, it's in the middle of the mountains, and the ports are both in the west and in the north. And those ports are, I don't know, 1,200 kilometers away from the city. And Colombia had this way that the main ports and the main consuming and productivity centers are very far from each other. So our logistics are very challenging. So this is Bogota, and this is the sector. We have, I would say, two major challenges here. We have, of course, a major challenge with air quality. We are having a lot of trouble with air quality. We have to acknowledge that. The transport sector is responsible for 86% of the PM emissions in the sector. And we have an old fleet. We have a very old fleet. And a very important number of the PM emissions, 42% of PM10, come from the freight sector. So we are dealing with a fleet that needs to be renewed and we're dealing again at the same time with a lot of urban renewal processes where we're trying to say that this center, the CBD of Bogota, needs to be protected, needs to be a lot more clean, needs to be cleaner. And we are trying to understand how we can continue providing, of course, all the logistical processes and distribute freight and cargo through different vehicles. So this is the first challenge that we have. And the second challenge that we have is how through large infrastructure projects, we can make sure that freight comes in more sustainable manners. So we have these two big challenges. This is what I was telling you previously. The fleet is not as new as we would like. For example, we are going a lot faster with buses and passenger vehicles with our renewal, but we're having a lot of trouble with renewal of the cargo and freight fleet. So now in the development plan, we have structured a fund which is coming from public funds. It's also incorporating private funds. And we are trying to add a little tax to the different services that would go to this special vehicle where we could gather all these funds from the public, from the private, and from the tariffs that come from the services. And of course, generate additional resources so that we can increase and accelerate the renewal of the fleet. We're having a lot of challenges, of course, with our new pandemic times, where we have a lot more questions than answers. As Rosario, we were seeing a large increase in e-commerce, but then again, we do not see regulation that is pacing at the same time with how these volumes of e-commerce are coming now. And here, I don't see that we have a lot of international experiences, and perhaps Sunny and this panel could be a little bit, we could devote a little bit of time to discuss that. When you talk to FedEx, Amazon, and those services, the next day delivery and within the same day delivery are becoming far more demanded by the public. And I'm not really sure why. I'm not really sure why that sense of urgency with asking, when you want to buy things over the internet, you want to have them right now, you want to have them either the same day or the next day. And I don't feel that regulation is showing and reflecting, of course, all the negative externalities that desire, that urgency need, and the price, right? On the contrary, when you ask a lot and you buy a lot, then you have a lot of discounts. And you can say, okay, so you have free shipping if you ask it for 3 days. And then I feel that the customer and the public is not aware of all the pressure that is putting on the network. So I feel that we should be doing a lot of more awareness campaigns with the public, trying to tell them, okay, it's not like you're asking for medicines or you're running to a hospital. You can wait a couple of days more without putting all that pressure on the supply chain. So I feel that the e-commerce, of course, is growing very fastly. And the regulation, of course, as always, we come a little bit behind. And this is something that we should be discussing. I remember reading on the New York Times how next day services are growing faster than traditional times. And I don't feel that any regulation is reflecting that into price or through campaigns of awareness. We are trying to build a strategy that is called Bogota 24/7. It's not very new. We have been trying to do that in the past. And we have two challenges here in trying to develop this strategy of Bogota 24/7. First one is safety and security. Some of these industrial warehouses are located in not the city center, a little bit farther away. And we have some security issues with those further locations. And we're trying to work with the security secretary. But then again, it's not very easy. You need to coordinate better schedules so that perhaps police and other kind of security teams can accompany and match all these dispatches. And the second challenge that we're having is noise with the neighbors. So people do have some demands and do have some requirements, but then again, when you have to ask the community for some trade-offs, then of course the community says no. It's kind of the traditional NIMBY, they're not in my backyard. So you want to have logistics 24/7, and you want to have a city that never sleeps, but then you don't want to pay the costs. So that's an interesting trade-off that we need to balance. We are working with the World Bank, with our friend Felipe Targa, and with some others in the IFC, and with Logica, trying to develop this e-cargo bikes pilot, where, as I mentioned before, we're trying to shut down a little bit more to large vehicles, both as CBD, and we are understanding how we can move merchandise and cargo with these new vehicles. It's just a pilot that we are very excited about. And then again, we are trying to see how we can perhaps make this a little bit more widespread. But it's a very interesting pilot, and it's going to be changing a little bit more also the pace at which the CBD is moving now. We are working, as I told you, with trying to regulate a little bit more of the e-commerce, trying to have prices that reflect a little bit better the pressure that all these demands put on the system and on the network. We are working, as I mentioned before, on the productivity of Bogota 24/7. And here I wanted to ask another question for the panel, because we are working on that, and I'm not really sure that we are fully aware of the consequences and the impact that we're going to have long-term. Of course, in the transportation sector, we are saying that because of COVID and because of these pandemic times, it's better if we can reopen certain economic activities at different moments of the day. So we said construction and public works can open at 8 in the morning. Then, for example, manufacturers and some other industrial activities can open at 10. Shopping centers and retail and all of the public small retail and commerce can open at noon. And this, of course, for us from the mobility sector, is the best way to segregate and to use the infrastructure and the vehicles. Because pre-pandemic times, of course, we had everybody would start moving at 7 in the morning and everybody would go home at 6 p.m., right? So now that we don't have schools and that we have these segregated times in which the economic activities are reopening, we are seeing that we are using more efficiently our infrastructure, our vehicles, and all the information that we have. And from our side, this is very interesting. And then again, it's more efficient, and the infrastructure that we have on the network and the system is working better. We are seeing, of course, less congestion, less accidents, less fatalities due to road traffic. But then again, we don't know if that is sustainable in the long term, and that we are having major impact in the productivity change of the different economic activities. So from our side, from the transportation side, it's more efficient and it's more intelligent to use our infrastructure in this way. But I'm assuming that we're going to have some economic impact on the productivity chains. So we are trying to understand this balance. If we want to stay with these new schedules where we are staggering and staging this opening of different economic activities, and if we want to continue like that after pandemic times, hoping that is not too far away in the horizon. We are having some other additional works and projects. We are trying to understand better how we can teach drivers and we have to have better driving patterns. And this is something that we have worked in the past before with ICLI and with some others. And basically this is what we're doing, focusing on cargo. I just want to take one extra minute, Sunny, if I can, to talk a little bit of what Bogota is doing with the cycling infrastructure, because it's been very interesting. It's helping us reduce, of course, the amount of people that are using Transmilenio and the public transportation system. We came very fast with these temporary bike lanes that now are going to become permanent. They're going to be 84 kilometers of additional infrastructure for bicycles. And this, of course, is not only helping passengers, but it's also helping all the network to redistribute and function in a more efficient manner. This is something that has been very challenging, both of the logistics and the operations, and then again also in the security for all our cyclists. But we are seeing how people are reacted very well. People are using them a lot. We are having corridors that are having 10,000, 11,000 passengers per day. So this is why we are gonna foster these new lanes as permanent. So we are now working on the infrastructure and the segregation and all the signaling so that these corridors are permanent now. And this is what I wanted to share with you. We are also trying to work a little bit more with the super blocks of Barcelona, doing traffic calming in some neighborhoods, and using this bicycle infrastructure to connect these vital neighborhoods that we are building. Thank you very much. And I hope to see some of these questions on the later on panel. Thank you very much, Sunny.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for the insights from Bogota. And actually, you made my life easier with asking questions already to the panel. So that helps a lot. So for our next presentation, we again return back to the Argentinian context. And we have with us Mr. Rodolfo Fiadone, who is a renowned expert in freight logistics. And he's a regular consultant of the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the CAF, and ICLEI, an international city network, and also to various provincial and national governments, and also to the private sector. So and he's also a professor at 4 different universities in the country. And his broad experience and expertise will give us an insight into the challenges faced by urban logistics in the Argentinian context. So Rodolfo, the floor is yours.
Muy bien, buenos días. Bueno, ante todo, voy a compartir mi pantalla.
Good morning. I'm going to share my screen. Hold on for a sec. Thank you so much, ITF, for inviting me, especially to Francisco Furtado and his team. We were walking around Buenos Aires for a week last year in a very cold Buenos Aires, talking about these issues. I am the last one. Several concepts have been mentioned already, so I will go over them very quickly to make the most of the triggers. First, I would like to speak a bit about the urban logistics in our country, at least, where there is a lot of different stakeholders, and they are very different in their levels as well. We have sectors, international load transport, and we also have very small stores everywhere in the city. We have big logistical operators, which are international companies, and people who just take their products on the back of their car, and they are also part of the urban logistics. When it comes to units, we have very modern electrical units and trucks that are maybe 30 years old and that are distributing goods around the city. At the bottom, you can see the detail of different competition for the use of the public space. This was already mentioned in other presentations. The image that I put here is so that we don't feel as bad in our country or Latin American countries. The pictures that you can see on the screen are around 2 years old. And as you can see, when it comes to loading and offloading and distributing products in the city, happens in the best cities in the world. You can see one of the pictures here is Buenos Aires. Maybe the truck is a bit older, but the challenge of occupying public space and double parking is everywhere. They've asked me to speak about Argentina. the problem when it comes to urban logistics in Argentina. There are three big cities: Córdoba, Rosario, and Greater Rosario, which Eva mentioned, and the city of Buenos Aires, or the conglomerate of the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires. When it comes to Córdoba, it is interesting to see each of these cities, because although they belong to the same country, they have very different challenges, and this is part of the difficulty when it comes to solving urban logistics issues. Córdoba is the capital of the province. It is in the center of the country, in the economic center of the country at least, and besides all of the problems they have for urban logistics, it is a place where you get the crossing of loads for the north, east, and west. So it is a kind of hub, cross-docking hub for the whole of the country. It also has loads that do not belong to the province. The same happens in Rosario. It is a port city, as Eva mentioned, and there's also cross-docking from other cities. And Buenos Aires is also a port city, but it is oriented towards containers, and it also has a lot of railways. Córdoba is a very big city. It is one of the biggest cities in the world when it comes to surface, 576 square kilometers, and most of it, 25% of it, is still not urban, it is sub-rural. Córdoba has a micro-center which is visited by over 1 million tourists a year, where we have cathedrals, old buildings. You cannot go in with any type of vehicle. And then we have another concentric area where you have a ring road, which is over 70 kilometers long. So you take an idea of how big the city is. And we have most services that are outside the city. And therefore, the city, when it comes to urban distribution, uses vans or small trucks, mid-sized trucks, because the distances are so big. So you have to carry the load for a long time until you reach the center.
Dio unos números distintos a los míos en
Eva
cantidad.
spoke a lot about Rosario. Trust her number. She has a different inhabitant number than I have. Rosario also has a city center that is big, with very, very narrow streets. And the city is taking care of this issue, but they also have a ring road that is stopping being ring road because the limitations of the city are in red, and the city is going over that ring road. This is a very dense city, has a lot of inhabitants, and the difficulty is that it has a river that does not allow it to expand further east, and that is a limit for circulation as well. It is a bulk freight port, so there is 120,000 trucks a year that take grain through the ring road every year. And of course, they contaminate the urban environment through that ring road. And once they offload, they are a bit distributed all over the city, these trucks. It is a reality that doesn't have to do with urban logistics, but it has to do with the circulation and the traffic. And then we have the monster of the region, which is the metropolitan region of Buenos Aires with 15 million inhabitants. In the surface of the country, we have 40% of the GDP, and 25%, 35% of the country's population lives there, and we can focus on what is in green, which is the metropolitan area. You can see the density goes up to 3,400 inhabitants per square kilometer, and in the center of the city, almost 3 million inhabitants and a density that is one of the highest densities on the planet with 14,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. It is a city where daily over 2 million people come in and out, whether to work or study or to carry out other activities, 3 million tourists a year. This number, my colleagues may dispute it, but I based it on the Metropolitan Observatory of Architecture. Some people say that less people come in a day, but even if it's half of this figure, what I want to say is that the number of people that come in and out, it is equivalent to the amount of people who live in the city. So the city is a lung that goes up and down of people who come in and out and consume within the city. In particular, in the city of Buenos Aires this year, an operational administration for urban logistics was created in 2020. This is the first time we have had a secretariat that deals with urban logistics. And to talk about the projects that we are seeing at the moment, we are working on a law for the use of garages and parking lots for cross-docking, so you can actually carry it out there. Also to drive e-vehicles and assisted e-vehicles. This is very difficult because besides from the regulations in the city, there are regulations at national level when it comes to normalizing this, and many different organisms have to do with this. So the aspiration of using e-vehicles is a very interesting, noble and positive aim, but there are tax issues and many aspects make it very challenging to work on this, not from the technical level, but from the regulatory level. We're also working on a law to regulate deliveries when it comes to using bikes or other types of vehicles. And we're also beginning to develop a good practices for logistics in very small areas of the city because of what was mentioned by my colleagues when it comes to the fact that it's very difficult to deal with the city as a whole. There are many regions that have different areas. So to just take smaller areas to be able to check what happens to all stakeholders that have to live in that area or work in that area, and to then expand that to bigger sectors of the city. When it comes to the effects of the confinement of the quarantine over urban logistics with regards to e-commerce, we can see that 71% of units that were distributed went up 71% in the month of April. The complexity in logistics that was expected for the next 2 years happened in 6 weeks, and this has completely changed the logistical panorama in the city. When it comes to the effects of confinement in urban logistics, you can see that there are many, but I want to highlight the fact that there is complexities to do with delays in delivering to the shops due to the fact that the shops are closed, and also complications in the fact that the pedestrians have more space to move because the city has decided to expand the space for pedestrians, and therefore this makes for a competition of the urban space for vehicles, load vehicles and pedestrians. These are problems that were existent but became more evident with this situation. This is not new. This is something that was happening before, and the confinement has made it more visible and evident. I also want to highlight what is at the bottom here when it comes to the abrupt development, unexpected, of best practices for e-commerce, improvements that were very quickly done for identifying products, the simplification of deliveries, the the fact that you don't have to sign a paper anymore, so there's no physical contact, the expansion of click and collect or e-lockers, so there's no contact between the person who delivers the product and the person who receives it, and the expansion of fast delivery platforms. Anybody who has worked in logistics know that for over 30 years, that when inventory is distributed in more warehouses, the movement is increased necessarily. So all of these solutions that help to improve urban logistics expand movement. The movement of what? It could be trucks, it could be vans, it could be bicycles, it could be more environmentally friendly vehicles, but you get more traffic and more congestion, more movement, and this is an additional challenge that e-commerce puts on urban logistics, as one of my other colleagues mentioned as well. What can we expect? I believe in our country that after the confinement period, logistical operators will be strengthened, especially the big ones, those who have the potential to incorporate green vehicles, who can invest in technological platforms that can solve the financial issues, and also the very small ones, the informal ones, the ones that normally harm the environment the most, because there will be an informal economy will go up. And of course, the new players who are based on fast delivery platforms will also become strengthened. We will also have more competition for the urban space, more pedestrians, more bicycles, the fact that we need more space so that people move safely. This will mean that the space will be disputed, and also there will be less occupation of the public transport. Not so many people are able to go on each bus. That will mean that we will need more units to transport people. So what I think we can expect is higher complexity in the cities. Lastly, when it comes to Argentina, I believe it is important when we speak about urban logistics and the possibility of incorporating new technologies, that for private operators, fuel is not the main cost factor when it comes to urban logistics. So when you see it from the operation of a private sector who wants to save costs, they will save on something else first. The fact that an e-vehicle or a more efficient vehicle allows them to spend less fuel will not be a deciding factor for this person. The cost is the actual employee. There are many tax and union issues when it comes to the amount of people that have to be in a distribution truck, especially when it comes to delivering drinks. So the fuel factor will not be the main factor when it comes to making decisions. Also, we will see that there will be an economic situation in the state and the private sector that will be disastrous at the end of confinement. It'll be very difficult to think about new investment. And I don't want to be so negative and pessimistic, but I believe that the process that we are undergoing in Rosario, in Córdoba, or in Buenos Aires, with the incorporation of the urban logistics to the state as a problem that needs to be taken care of from the state's point of view is good. And the new apps, if they're well managed and well thought out, may develop more environmentally friendly ways to deliver goods and make everybody live in a better way. I think this is a chance that we must make the most of. I have finished. I hope I was clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the inputs, Rodolfo. It's very insightful and thought-provoking, I should say. Yeah, so we have now reached the end of the panel inputs, and that means we are in the question and answer round. And we have collected questions from the question and answer box, and all our colleagues are also very curious. So we have a large set of questions for all of you. And in addition to that, Nicholas also had a couple of questions. So maybe I'll ask the first question to Matthias. The question is analysis of last mile solutions being addressed systematically or on a country focused perspective? How lessons learned can be shared in the last case?
Yeah, I mean, the typical academic response here is probably it depends. But so what we see is that in terms of solutions, things are transferable. So for instance, what I mentioned before in my presentation, this move towards multi-tiered distribution approaches. In one way or the other, you see this across all cities around the world. And it's independent of whether that is a city in Argentina, in India, or in Germany, for instance. We see very similar conceptual approaches. So for instance, if you think of Germany, you would probably think, well, why would Germany require multi-tiered distribution? But if you look at what UPS, for instance, does here in Hamburg, you see they use exactly that, because even a city like Hamburg is facing congestion issues, is facing increasing requests by e-commerce consumers, is facing tighter regulation in terms of emissions. So it's not just, let's say, the quote unquote mega cities of this world that are facing these problems. It's actually pretty much every bigger city around the world. How it's being operationalized, that differs, obviously. So while, for instance, in the US, with some of our research partners, we are thinking about multi-tiered distribution that use high-tech like drones or delivery robots, doing that, let's say, in, let's pick a city, let's say in Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo or cities like that, you would probably not necessarily want to use that as the primary basis of technology to make that happen, for various reasons, for security reasons, for infrastructural requirements and the like. The technology that you use to implement these systems differs, but the idea behind is pretty much still the same. You're trying to combine different characteristics of different vehicle types, different engine technologies, to cope with the constraints and restrictions that you face in different parts of the city. So same thing with policy interventions, right? If you look at what many cities around the world have been trying when it comes to restricting access to inner city areas, they all are trying to achieve the same thing, but they are not necessarily doing it on the same technological playing field. Today, a lot of people talk about, for instance, smart cities and smart curbside management. And yes, that's a great idea, but in a city like Bangalore, for instance, that may not work as easily as in a city like Los Angeles. So again, it's pretty much like the general insights from our research are transferable, but it very much depends on the local context to what degree technology can actually help to implement those ideas.
Great. I mean, since you mentioned the innovative transport modes and the automated vehicles front, I have a follow-up question for you. So the question goes, how do you think automated modes and multimodal alternatives will be embraced in Latin American countries?
Actually, multimodal models have been embraced by Latin American cities much earlier than, for instance, in North America or in Europe. So think about using cargo bikes. If you go to places like Bogota or Buenos Aires, for that matter, that's not a very new idea to use cargo bikes to deliver goods to urban clients. The question is, how do you embed these cargo bikes into the larger logistics systems? So how do you make sure these are, let's say, managed well, the routes of these vehicles are planned well, and maybe their technology is being upgraded from being a simple cargo bike to something a little bit more, let's say, solid, like electrically supported cargo bikes, for instance. But the idea for this has been around for so many years. So for instance, Coca-Cola in in Rio de Janeiro was one of the first ones who was praised for using trucks to go into the inner city area, and then basically that having that truck meet with motorcycles basically to do the final delivery of Coca-Cola bottles. They did this because of a requirement of the city and because of the very tightly constrained local conditions. Now other cities around the world are trying to adopt similar schemes, obviously in a, let's say, more technology-enabled framework. But it's been Latin America, amongst others, who have been at the forefront of, let's say, multimodal systems for quite a long time.
Great, thank you so much. So the next questions to Eva. You were talking about holistic approach in addressing the urban logistics challenge. So the question was, what do you think about a better and a more extensive use of the railway network? For instance, the Rosario Circle Ring. Could these help reduce the number of trucks crossing the city?
Sí, sí, por supuesto. O sea,
Yes, of course. The truth is I didn't speak about that because it has to do with the port transport, and that is another world completely, and that's why I only spoke about urban logistics and transport. But of course, the railway network, which is almost finished, we don't need a lot of investment to finish it off completely, although of course it's a lot for us to invest in Argentina, but there are big drives towards the railway, and that would diminish the amount of trucks that go in, especially when it comes to the time that grain is picked up everywhere in Rosario. I mean, it would be another, it's more to do with metropolitan transport than urban logistics, but yes, of course it would help.
Great, thanks. So continuing with the city experiences, my next question is to Nicolas. So the question goes, in passenger transport, there is this common agreement about massive transport, i.e. metro or other public transport, is more sustainable than private car transport. Is there something similar in freight transport, with countries taking measures against growing of these small cargo vehicles like motorbikes or three-wheelers because of congestion issues?
I don't think that we are at that stage yet. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I feel that Bogota and Colombia in general have been having a lot more experience in passengers than in cargo and in freight. And I feel that we have trying to address these challenges through several years now, and we had different moments where we have been a little bit more successful than others. Currently in Bogota, at least, there's acceptance and there's kind of this consensus that you need to make logistics and multimodal systems be more efficient. And that has some implications both on taxes, on regulation, and the number of vehicles. And this is where we are now. This is where we are. We have not been yet into the discussion of, for example, reducing the fleet, the vehicles, the amount of vehicles. We are understanding how we can use more efficiently the different kind of vehicles at the different stages of the chain. But I would say there's not still that deep conversation in which we can reach that consensus. We are still working on that. We are working, as Matthias said, on the regulation on how to restrain the CBD, but there is no political consensus on reducing the number of vehicles. We're just like testing different alternatives.
Just a follow-up to that, because I know you are stressed for time, and my follow-up, it's a personal curiosity. You were talking about staggered hours of operation for freight delivery. Did you experiment in late night freight deliveries? Because I mean, I saw some experiences from New York, which seemed to be successful with late night deliveries. Was that an option? Or?
Yes, that's an option, and we are taking 2 pilots in which we're testing late night deliveries. And as I mentioned, the major challenge here is safety and security. So we are doing this pilot testing in company with police and with the security secretariat, and that is working well. But as I mentioned before, I'm not really sure from the transport, from the mobility side, those measurements permanent. We want to keep on with those policies, but I'm sure that we are affecting and we are having impacts in the supply chain and the productivity chain, although from the mobility side, as the other panelists mentioned, the dispute over the public space is of course increasing. So we need to stagger and we need to make these schedules match a little bit better.
Great, thanks. The next question, I again come back to Eva. So the question goes, apart from the e-commerce platform, has the local government provided any assistance or support to small and traditional businesses who did not sell products online before the pandemic in terms of product delivery?
Bueno, principalmente fue
Mainly, it was a very fast thing to get together and to get used to e-commerce. That was a big challenge. But on the other hand, with regards to the transporting of goods, what we did is to give the chance to the transport of passengers that were being underutilized to be used for e-commerce purposes. In that sense, the recommendations were for the use of taxis or school vans. We allowed, since the beginning of the pandemic, helping with special regulations to be able to allow these vehicles to send and transport load and goods to consumers. These were the recommendations, not to add more vehicles, but to make use of the vehicles that had less work but were already circulating.
Great, thanks. So the next question is actually to Rodolfo. So the question, I do an online translation from Spanish to English, so excuse me. So what are the trends for the estimation of origin destination matrices in cities? What technologies are being incorporated, like telephony, GPS, etc.? And is there a is the current practice derived from methods based on seed matrices and entropy maximization? Or are there new methods?
Bueno, ok. Lo que se está trabajando en la
What
actualidad.
we are working on right now is with the information that comes from Google and other platforms, especially Google Maps. We are working with phone companies, but nevertheless, not in the city of Buenos Aires, at least. This is focused to the movement of people, not load. The load movement, there's very little statistics. It's one of the serious issues we face, and how to get these data due to the complexity that I mentioned before of the so many stakeholders that take part, and they work in many different ways. Each product that exists has a different logistics in the city, and therefore it is, I am convinced, and what we're working on in the city of Buenos Aires at least, of the fact that it is not possible, or it is very difficult to analyze this through origin destination matrices that are used in big volume. In urban logistics, you have to talk about very specific sectors or neighborhoods that have very specific problems to understand
Is it just me or?
Sorry, he froze.
I think
This
we
is the
lost him for a
interpreter.
second.
We lost Rolfo, yeah.
Yeah.
Parking. Can you hear me?
Yes, now
Can you hear me?
Okay. Disculpen, no sé hasta dónde llegue. Oh. Así. Bien. Bueno, retomo.
Okay, so I'll thank you to the interpreter who helps me remember where I got to. I was saying that I am convinced, since we're beginning to work in the city of Buenos Aires, that we have to work on smaller areas to analyze the difficulties that they face logistically. It's not the same with a neighborhood that has a lot of hotels or schools than a neighborhood where you have a lot of workshops or small industries, or where there are many clothes shop. For example, the Avenue Cabildo, for those who know Buenos Aires, where mostly has a lot of clothes shops, than other areas where there are different factors. So I believe the analysis should be carried out in a more micro way to be able to understand who the stakeholders are, then you catalog them, and then to understand their needs and their interest, and to be able to focus and do focus groups that can partner in order to improve the issue of distribution.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe there's one question. I mean, this was actually posed by Nicholas to the entire panel. What are the best practices for cities in managing e-commerce? Are they applicable to Latin American cities? And what policy, how is the policy changing for e-commerce? Maybe would Matthias take a stab at this first?
Sure. I mean, and maybe I have a different opinion here than some other panelists, but what Nicholas was also mentioning was the problem that while e-commerce kind of promotes this need for faster delivery, for more on-demand consumption, it doesn't really internalize the true cost. And that's very true. I mean, if we look at how these services are typically priced, and I don't want to call out specific companies here, but just think of a service like Amazon Prime Now. Yeah, you pay for that, but the price you pay is far from what the actual cost of that service would be. Not just the economic cost to Amazon itself, but also the cost to society in terms of congestion, in terms of wear and tear of the road infrastructure, in terms of emissions and other health effects. So yes, cities should work on frameworks to somehow internalize these costs. And that's not easy, because what some cities have tried in the past was to just basically ban commercial vehicle traffic from cities, or to make that more costly per se. And that's, to be honest, not a very smart approach, because stuff still needs to go into cities. Even if you double the cost of a truck going into the city, the alternative is not that the truck would stay outside of the city. That's just not going to happen. At the end of the day, what's going to happen is that this additional cost is just going to be passed on to the consumer to pay for it, but it doesn't really solve the actual problem. It does not create incentives to, let's say, postpone shipments and the like. So I think an important approach would be to actually incentivize the consumers somehow to choose more wisely or to choose greener delivery approaches. So some of my colleagues, for instance, have worked with a couple of retailers on understanding whether a green button, what they call it, a green button in the checkout process of an online platform would actually change consumer behavior. So basically arguing to the consumer, hey, if you get this not tomorrow, but in 2 or 3 days from now, you may not be saving a lot of money, but you're actually saving the environment, I don't know, 100 trees, just to put it like figuratively. And that actually turned out to be very effective. So I think cities should work with the private sector to encourage the private sector to implement such schemes. Just restricting vehicle access to cities and just trying to impose some fees or fines or whatever to logistics operators, in our experience, does not really solve the problem.
That's very interesting. If I remember it right, I think the UK government did something similar research on behavior of consumers. So it went more in the direction of behavioral economics to see how to nudge people to green behavioral changes. Yeah, but Rodolfo, I think you have something to add, because I was sensing that you were agreeing to what Matthias was mentioning. Do you want to add something to that point?
Sí, perdón.
Yes. No, I agree with him. I believe it is impossible to avoid these vehicles moving around. The operator will always want the load to reach. They will use bigger, smaller vehicles. It is difficult because it is difficult to impose things, and it is difficult to make the community understand the difficulties that these sales imply. I think Nicolas said that people want everything quicker, but they're not wanting to pay the cost for that. I think we must get them to become aware, the community at large must become aware of the fact that we should all work towards this awareness. One of the things that I think is very interesting is the fact that, at least in Argentina, we have tried. It is more important to have a precise time of delivery rather than the actual time of delivery, to make consumers and retailers be convinced that it's preferable to agree on a day and a time for delivery, and this is more important than actually getting the product in an hour, which may not even get there. And to be able to program a time, so I know that I will get it tomorrow or the day after tomorrow at 6 p.m. allows me to program my schedule and also the retailer. Unfortunately, I think we have become used to the fact that we want everything faster. It's difficult to roll back, because when you're comfortable, it's very hard to get back to being uncomfortable. But I believe what Matthias is speaking about, awareness, and people should know the implications of the acceleration of these type of deliveries, and the community should be made aware of that.
Great, thank you so much. Just a follow-up to that, because in your presentation you were talking about the involvement of the private sector and how the private sector would suffer once we get out of the COVID crisis, or they'll be worst hit, if I understood it right. But then you also mentioned that they would have a crucial role to play if they are adopting greener vehicles for freight movement and deliveries. My question there is, what would be the role of the government, be it the national, provincial, or a city, in enabling the private sector to move to these green vehicles, because economically they would be in not a very good state after the crisis. So I think the government can step in, but how do you think is the right approach for this to step, for the government to step in?
Bueno, a ver, yo creo que
I believe the approach when it comes to government should be to favor or to legislate in such a way that the private operator can incorporate not only new technologies, but also new procedures. As I said in my presentation, we're working on a delivery law, and this is not unimportant because these new operators that have turned up, I'm speaking about Rappi, Uber, and other operators that do rapid delivery service, generate spaces that are a bit difficult to understand when it comes to road safety, for example. So many cyclists that are delivering things, not only the chance of crashing towards other vehicles, but also against people. They use pavements, they occupy space where pedestrians should dwell. So to try and see the way that the government can organize this, this will help, but it also help to organize the space, but also the fact that operators may work in a way that competition among them can be more loyal, more fair, and more organized. There are some operators who use very old vehicles. This is a very serious issue. They're very contaminating vehicles that do these deliveries. I showed, for example, in the case of Córdoba city, we have a ring road that is over 70 kilometers in length. We need vehicles that are pretty big to be able to deliver things there in a way that is economically efficient. Nevertheless, it's not so many kilometers, so they are still using old units which contaminate greatly. For example, when it comes to fizzy water being delivered in very, very old vehicles, and they don't really do long distances. They stop every 50 meters or so to deliver. They don't really need very efficient vehicles. So we need to push for change. What I wanted to say is that the chance for the biggest operators should be to how to apply these new technologies, information technologies, to generate more efficient networks, to make combinations, to use smaller cross-docking warehouses that can then be derived into smaller vehicles. In the city of Buenos Aires particularly, this used to be very difficult to regulate because we didn't have a place in the government that regulated it. We need to combine all of this with national regulations. As I said before, a vehicle in our city needs to have a sort of homologation at national level. They're difficult to get permits because they might not be regulated. There are types of vehicles that don't really exist on the records. We must change the way these permits are issued because they're not cataloged, some of these types of vehicles. For example, small four-wheel vehicles without a driver, where somebody is hauling the vehicle, they're not recorded. So insurance companies, if there is an accident, for example, if they're not recorded, they won't pay. So there is a lot to do. The government needs to do a lot to make operators use new technologies.
Great. So that brings me to Eva, because Rodolfo says that the government needs to do a lot more. So as the government, what do you think can be done to encourage this shift to green vehicles from the private sector?
Y bueno, en principio yo considero que es
To
clave.
begin with, I think the government has a key role to play. After having had experiences in different cities, the government can articulate and has to come in to solve this diversity of interests and needs that are in the sector. It is impossible for the private sector to agree. So in that sense, to push for regulations that can think of these needs and understanding the dynamism that this urban logistic has is key. So what the city of Buenos Aires is doing when it comes to cross-docking platforms or regulation of delivery services is key when it comes to helping the private sector. It is not only the articulating nature of our intervention, but also regulations, and the private sector can give us information, because one of the questions was to do with matrices, etc., and things that we use a lot for Argentina. When you speak about loading vehicles, the information is there. The private sector has this information, so the alliance between the private and the public is key to solve this issue. This alliance must happen so we both get benefits. The private sector will be benefiting from this because they may be able to reduce their logistic costs. They might have a more efficient service, and from the point of view of the cities, the benefits that we might get when it comes to solving this issue will be very, very big.
Nice. It's very nice that you mentioned on the data, because it links me to Matthias' presentation, because you were talking about data in your presentation, Matthias. And when you were saying, when we were talking about it, I was wondering if there is enough data at the city level or at the Latin American context, or what data is available. But then at the same time, when I listen to what Eva mentions, I kind of retrospect when I think there is data that is there with the private company who are doing these logistic operations. So my question to you is there enough data? What data needs to be collected, and what do cities need to keep in mind? And how to get this data from the private sector for the better use at a government level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, I mean, the data is there most of the time. The problem actually is that it's not very easy to share it because, I mean, luckily there's more and more publicly available data. Like someone mentioned Google Maps before, a service that hasn't been there like 10 years ago. And now both we as researchers, but also many companies that we work with and policymakers that we work with are using Google Maps data, for instance, to understand traffic patterns, which is very valuable. So there's a couple of these publicly available sources of data. But the real deal is combining that publicly available data with private information. So for instance, if I have multiple vendors distributing goods to the same city, I want to understand who the customers are, when they are being served, how frequently they are being delivered to, how big the deliveries are, and basically, ideally, also what is being delivered. This is obviously information that a usual vendor doesn't want to share because there's just too much risk associated to giving away that confidential information. A lot of that information is actually highly sensitive to their competitive edge over other vendors that are competing with them. So sharing that data is usually very difficult, and that's also why I believe from the cities that we've been working with so far that cities are sometimes not the best people to actually ask for that data. I mean, I'm also advertising my own profession here a little bit, but that's usually where academia comes into play, because we are usually seen as a little bit more neutral than a city, because we don't necessarily have an own agenda in this. We are just interested in understanding the data and deriving recommendations. So what we've seen in the past with various cities that we've worked with is that bringing in that neutral party sometimes helps to bring data from various different vendors and from the city and from public sources together and analyze those effectively. The second thing that I wanted to point out is that, and that's another reason to actually engage academia more, is the ability to analyze the data properly. I mean, data is great, but it's only great if you know how to really extract information from it, because a lot of policymaking can be misled if you analyze the data in the wrong way. And the data that we're talking about is not always very trivial. Can be things like GPS traces that have to be actually properly treated and prepared and then analyzed to actually derive insights from that can be used for policymaking. And if you do that wrong, the policymaking will be wrong. And that's where I think academia can bring talent that cities, but also most companies don't necessarily have readily available to help them understand that data with the latest state of methods, basically.
Great. Yeah, maybe this is a question to all of you. I mean, you can take turns to answer this question. So the question goes, what are the incentives for the public to change their consumer behavior and the businesses to change their delivery routine when new regulations are implemented? When new regulations and implementation come into effect? Maybe Eva wants to start first, or?
Si quieren,
Yeah.
arranco yo. Para mí, el mismo incentivo.
For me, the same incentive that they have had when it came to changing the mobility patterns of people, when we understood that it is more economical, more sustainable, and that sometimes we get there quicker if we go on a bike, for example. That makes us to choose that way. It is on the side of the benefit that the consumer or the retailer may get when they prioritize that purchase. If I prioritize the cost in my purchase or the fact that it is delivered quicker, I'm going to choose the modality. And in that sense, that will be the regulations that we will apply. Less cost at social, environmental, and economic levels.
Matthias, you seem to have.
Yeah, I mean, I think, let's say when we look at the consumer, I think consumer behavior will only change if that change provides some sort of superior convenience. Because even if you price certain delivery services differently, there's this concept of instant gratification that is very hard to overcome. So people perceive it as valuable to get things instantly, like clicking a button and basically getting the reward, getting the product right away. And that's very hard to overcome, even with just basically increasing the price for that. But if you are able to kind of incentivize people by something that provides them more convenience. So if it actually is more convenient to wait for 2 days, but then, as Rodolfo said earlier, to know exactly when the product is going to come so that you don't have to wait for the delivery guy for 5 hours, but you know he's going to be there at 2 p.m. sharp and I'm going to be there and I'm going to get my product. That's the kind of education that works, I guess, on consumers. Same thing, and that's also where cities could play a role. If you enable more forms of unattended delivery. So for instance, if you enable, be it through regulatory changes or through infrastructure that's being provided, stuff being delivered without the consumer necessarily being present, be that through locker boxes or through drop-off locations in stores. If you make that happen, then people are actually willing to maybe wait a day longer, but they get that convenience from not having to wait for the service, but to basically be able to define when they actually get their product into their hands. And then on the company side, I think it's pretty easy. Company behavior will only change if there's an economic incentive to it. Regardless of sustainability agendas, at the end of the day, a company will only change its behavior if it saves cost or if it's increasing the revenue. So even if companies have a sustainability agenda saying we are promoting greener delivery services, the only logical reason for them to do that is because it attracts additional revenue, because it makes them more attractive as a service provider and gives them more business. Otherwise, they would be out of their mind to do it. So I think that's, again, something that cities need to take into account. There's very few, or actually no companies out there that just do green delivery services and put money into this for altruistic reasons. That's just not the case.
And that's how companies work too. Rodolfo, do you have something to add to this?
No, very little. I think everything has been said. I believe, since Matthias ran with this idea of the precise delivery time and not only the fast one, that can help the consumer and also the operator, because it allows them to schedule things in a more efficient manner. Because once they understand that this might have more efficiency, it will generate benefit for everybody. Nobody gets harmed and everybody gets a benefit from it. And also, I believe that in future, the media, the marketing from the state's point of view needs to work harder to be able to achieve changes in consumer awareness of how they should consume. This is a titanic challenge. It is not my expertise, but I believe in the end, you achieve things. The problem is it takes a long time to achieve because community changes behaviors very slowly. And the government systems that we have who rotate periodically sometimes means that we don't really get that kind of dynamism that we would need, but I don't have anything else to add. I wanted to add something with regards to the last question when it came to data. May I?
Please.
I agree completely with the fact that it is easier to get data if you're an academic than if you're the state. And I want to add that one of the issues why the private sector many a time doesn't want to provide information is not only due to the fact of competition, because generally companies know a lot about their competition. So perhaps they have even more data than we believe that they have. But many a time they are fearful, if you're in the private sector, that the state may use sensitive information. There is to generate tax. They want to take something away from me, the government, and therefore they want this information in order to tax me more. So we must have to build confidence and trust. This is very difficult. This has to do with the soft aspects of logistics, but there is a reticence on the private sector to give information to the state because they have had the experience that the state does not benefit them, and many a time it goes against them. So that's why.
Great. I mean, it's great that you pointed out on the need of taxing, and that brings me to the last question from the audience. The question goes like this: in the context of the growing need for curb management to organize logistics and all the other uses that are becoming more and more numerous, the only option seems to be public investment, both in management and information gathering systems, and in the physical organization of the space. Have alternative, mixed, etc. financing models being developed by any city? So maybe this is more an apt question for Rodolfo and Matthias, because you are talking about the international examples. And Rodolfo, do you want to go first?
Sí, no termino de comprenderla.
I didn't understand the question completely. I don't know if the option is, what do you mean by, I'm reading the question on the chat. I don't know what they mean by the fact that the only option seems to be the public investment. Yes, of course, there needs to be public intervention and investment to be able to achieve those systems. But then it says, if they were developed in some model city by alternate funding, I think I don't quite understand the question. I'm sorry. He's reading it from the chat directly.
I'm not entirely sure whether I understand the question either, but I'm still going to try and answer it. Basically, what I see is not necessarily that good curbside management systems are exclusively going to be funded and designed by cities. I would actually say the opposite is the case. I would say that the future, what people call smart curbside management, is probably going to be a very interesting field for startups and maybe even established companies to actually create businesses for. So basically, where imagine a company that gathers the data and basically provides analytical insight as to what part of the curb to use for what, for which purpose during what period of time during the day. I see this almost as a two-sided business model, where one of the customers for these services would be the city, basically purchasing such a service with the objective to alleviate traffic and congestion and emissions from the city. And the other side of the customer base being logistics service providers, for instance, who get information that helps them plan more efficient routes, that helps them take out uncertainty from their logistics operations. But naturally, I don't see the city being this one providing such services. I would rather see the city as one of the customers for those services. And that means, yes, they would be funding it, but by paying for the service, not necessarily by deciding what to invest in terms of infrastructure, data collection, and the like.
Eva, do you want to add something to it on the role of city?
In that sense, I consider the fact that as a city, we see and we should give, when it comes to redefining public space or to help with regulation, I don't think that it is only investment from the public sector when we speak about this issue, because as I said in my presentation, the articulation of the public and private sector is very important, and it must also be that every sector gets a benefit, so the input should be collaborative. Nevertheless, if there is funding or projects that can be worked on with funding, of course they will be welcome, and the role of the state is to access that funding. That is my opinion.
Great. So, I mean, this is the tough part in the entire session. We have to close the question and answers, and we have to wrap up the whole thing. But this is where everything is getting so exciting, and at the same time, we are bound by the time that is allocated to us. But this is not the end of this discussion, because as we mentioned in the beginning, all the presentations are recorded, and they'll be available on the conference website. And we also have a wonderful LinkedIn group with a lot of experts, including the speakers that we have today. And all of the audience, please feel free to join the LinkedIn group and interrogate our presenters in the LinkedIn group with your questions, and please continue the discussion. And yeah, I would also like to mention that there is the next session that is going to happen on the 23rd of July. And this session is, the 23rd of July session is going to be on transport and metropolitan governance. And we also have a very interesting and expert speaker lineup for this session. And I really hope that you will be available to join this session and share your insights in the question and answers round. So coming to the end, I would once again like to thank the wonderful speakers for your amazing contributions and for the time that you spared for this session, and also to the audience for their great participation, and the questions that you asked made my life easier because I was just reading your questions. Most importantly, I want to thank the interpreters, because that enabled us to communicate with each other. Otherwise, I mean, my Spanish is nothing. And also on behalf of the ITF and the Wuppertal Institute, I would like to profoundly thank the Ministry of Transport in Argentina for their tremendous support to make this event a possibility, the entire conference actually, and also to the German Environmental Ministry for funding this wonderful project, not just in Argentina, in Azerbaijan, Morocco, and India, and to do some great work with cities and the national government. And special thanks goes to our local partners, Sustentar and Let's LAC partnership, for their on-ground support, without which we would not have pulled this event through. So that's all from me, and thank you so much for your participation once again, and please don't forget to join our LinkedIn group. That is where you can continue the discussion. And yeah, thanks.
Adiós.
Thank you.